We have all heard the parable of the sower. Sower goes into the field and he sows grain. And the story has it that some grain falls on rocky soil. Rocky soil is unable to sustain the seed, and it dies. Some of the grain falls amongst weeds, and guess what happens, folks? The weeds choke it off. Some of the grain seeds fall on the pathway, and it burns it up quickly. And then some seed falls on good ground, and that seed sprouts up, and there is an abundance of new wheat. Bushels. As you know, there's nothing really wrong with the seed. The seed is good seed. God, in other words, sows good seed. God sows goodness. The problem is where the seed falls, and especially when it falls in places where it cannot grow. This is a problem that we have in our society today. Not so much with the seeds that we plant for food, but the seeds of our children. They are our seeds, and they need a good environment in which to grow. And yet, that's not what we have today. Our society has become somewhat depleted in its richness. How do you nurture someone in virtue if there is not a great amount of virtue around them? I also am concerned about what is being taught in our schools. There was a time we could depend on our schools to put forth a good lesson for young people. Patriotism, religion, a Bible reading, and those things are gone from our schools too. As a matter of fact, oftentimes children are being taught perversion regarding their sexuality. Also, they're not being taught the truths of our great American civilization. Many of the people teaching in schools have been themselves wrongly indoctrinated into believing things that are inimical to our American culture. As a matter of fact, many of them promote a Marxist ideology. We need to reinvigorate our culture. We need to make our soil fertile again. And we also need to rebuild our churches, because churches too have fallen short in teaching the truth. If you belong to a church that is politically correct, you are not believing in the Church of Jesus Christ. That is not the Bible. It is not the gospel. If you're being fed pablum week after week, where you might as well go read a Hallmark card, you are being cheated. Your church is a fraud. What must we do to create a better culture for our children, to reinvigorate the soil, so to speak? What must we do to give some depth to our children's lives so that they're not living simply off what is PC or the latest game they played on their video, but that they are living off truth, which has deep roots and will sustain them for the rest of their lives? That is the job of parents. Too many times parents have sloughed off their responsibilities, believing let other people do it. I'm too busy, I don't have the time. I'm not smart enough to do that. That's the job of the schools. That's the job of the churches. We have never in the history of this country needed good parents more than we do today. And so my comments today are very much directed at parents, at what you could do in order to help those seeds that God has given you to grow, to become virtuous men and women, patriotic men and women, holy men and women. But this must also be a message for aunts and uncles and grandparents, because you can help by telling your children what they can do to help their children. You can also supply some of the things that I'm going to recommend today that you do, that you make available in your home for your children. You are now responsible for educating your children. So what I'm going to recommend to you today are 3 areas where I'd like you to focus your attention and to supply your children with these recommendations that I have for you. First of all, let's take a look at the religious education of your child. Some of you may say, well, I send my child to Catholic school. And that's noble, and in many cases, Catholic schools do provide a wonderful education. But even in the Catholic schools, education has been watered down. And the education is only as good as the people who teach in those schools. And they've been educated, unfortunately, sometimes in universities who claim to be Catholic, and yet they give an education that is less than Catholic. You must be vigilant, and you must take responsibility that your children know the faith and know what is right and know what is wrong. I also warn you, religious education programs, as good as they try to be, are not enough. An hour or so a week does not build that strong foundation, does not give that image of a Christian life or a Catholic life for sure. Everybody should have a Bible in their house. It's the Word of God. It's important that we read the Bible. Everybody should have a copy of the Baltimore Catechism. You remember the Baltimore Catechism? That in no way disparages or minimizes the Catechism of the Catholic faith. It's a magnificent work, but it's rather thick and a little bit more complicated. The Baltimore Catechism, what was it about? That thick? Some of you are familiar with that catechism. We learned from that catechism. Some of the simple things we learned stay with us until this day, because we had to memorize them. Who made me? God made me. I didn't come from out of nowhere. A bunch of molecules colliding with each other and just happened to turn into me. How silly that is. Why did God make me? To know Him, to love Him, to serve Him in this world, so that I might be happy with Him in the next. Simple, but direct. This is not all there is. There is a life after this life, and we must live our lives in that way. Those teachings must be memorized. Get a copy. Go online, get a copy. If you don't have children at home, mail it to your grandchildren, to your nieces, to your nephews. And one last suggestion. Have some books on the lives of the saints. How inspiring it is to read the lives of the saints. We need heroic people to minister to the sick and be selfless with the graces and the health and the good things that God has given them. Put these books in your house, the Bible, the Baltimore Catechism, the lives of the saints. So here are my recommendations. Perhaps a time can be arranged where the whole family could sit down and watch some movies, which I think will help to enrich the soil, give it some depth. First one is the 10 Commandments. They don't want them in the schools anymore. Take down the tablets from the schools. Don't teach the 10 Commandments in school. Why not? Because our society is anti-God. In place of God's rule, they want to put man's rule. What a wonderful movie, 10 Commandments. How can you forget Charlton Heston playing Moses up on that Mount Sinai and receiving God's commandments? Commandments that are what we call part of natural justice that any human being should know. Remember the movie, The Greatest Story Ever Told? My gosh, wasn't that a beautiful movie? It's the gospel, the life of Christ. Watch this magnificent movie on the life of Christ, the greatest story ever told. And it is the greatest story ever told. God becomes one with us. He suffers and dies for us, and he rises from the dead. It doesn't get any better than that. Some of you might remember another movie about the life of Jesus. It's called Jesus of Nazareth, an extremely beautiful movie. I can still remember the beautiful scenes with the angel coming to the Virgin Mary, that Annunciation scene. Next, some of you might recall Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul. And St. Paul was played by Sir Anthony Hopkins. What marvelous apostles, Peter and Paul. They go out to the whole world and tell the good news. Bring Peter and Paul into your home. Let your children see what those Acts of the Apostles are all about, what the epistles of St. Paul are all about. That's the faith. Let them experience it. Let them see a wonderful rendition of the two great apostles, one to the Gentiles and one to the Jews. Fourth, I'm going to recommend to you the movie The Cardinal. Some of you might remember that movie. It was produced, I believe, in the 1960s, but it also in that movie told the story of what the church did for the black community in the South when the Jim Crow laws were in effect, and that when priests and bishops were assigned to the South, how they themselves were persecuted for helping the black people. See the physical, emotional suffering that the church went through to bring justice to our African American brothers and sisters. People often forget about that. Another movie I'm going to recommend to you is On the Waterfront. This movie tells the story about how the unions and the owners of big shipping companies controlled the waterfront, the longshoremen, and how these men were abused by these people in power. And who was there but the church to speak about social justice? Social justice is not something new. It's been the theme of the church forever. Social justice, protecting the rights of workers, the rights of the poor, and to sacrifice oneself so that justice might be done. That's the church we belong to. Some of you might remember a movie called Yankee Doodle Dandy. What a magnificent movie. Jimmy Cagney starred in this movie, and he played George M. Cohan. And there were some marvelous patriotic songs that George M. Cohan wrote. At the end of the movie, Cagney gets an appointment to see the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. George M. Cohan walks into the Oval Office. The President is sitting at his desk, and the President thanks him for the great service he's done to his country by inspiring the men who are fighting in the European theater, and the great spirit that brought, pride in America, and that America is a country that takes responsibility not only for itself, but for other people. Europe would not be Europe if it were not for this country. If you want to see what our troops suffered in Europe, some of you might remember the movie The Longest Day. See the sacrifices made by our men to save Europe on those beaches of Normandy, and Omaha Beach, and so many other places where our troops landed and so many lost their lives. You want to see what happened in the Eastern Theater of War, World War II? Go to Bridge over the River Kwai, another magnificent movie. What we did in order to save the world from a vicious Japanese empire who was intent on world domination. We were there too, and we saved the world from Japanese hegemony in the Eastern Theater. Lastly, I'm going to recommend to you one of the most beautiful movies ever written. You see, we need beautiful things. We need to be inspired by beauty and goodness and right and love. I'm going to recommend to you that beautiful movie, The Sound of Music. Oh my gosh, the hills are alive with the sound of music. I had a pastor once, his name, Monsignor Peter Cavallucci. And Monsignor Cavallucci believed that the VCR was the greatest invention ever made. Why? Because he could watch The Sound of Music every time he wanted to. And that happened to be every day. And I said to him one day, I said, Monsignor, I said, why do you watch The Sound of Music every day? And he said to me, because everything that is good and beautiful is contained in that movie. Enrich the soil where you're going to have your children grow. Give it some depth. Fill it with beauty and fill it with a wonderful knowledge of what America has done for the world and what the Bible calls us to do, how to live in a good and just society. As you can imagine, producing this wonderful program, Action for Life, it costs a great deal of money. We're going to need your help. So if you would like to donate to keep this good news program on the air, please go to your computer, your cell phone, actionforlife.net. And now for our thought for the day. Prayer is extremely important. We're not fighting a battle just against earthly powers. We're fighting a battle against evil. Please take some time each day to pray and ask God for the strength that you need and that we need to keep up the battle for life. We now must go a little bit further. We have to talk about America. I talked about some of the movies and some of the great things that Americans have done, and some of the inspiring things that the movies have portrayed for us. This country is based on some magnificent documents. We don't hear enough about those documents today. Take a look at the Mayflower Compact. This is even before we became a nation. The Pilgrims came over here and they had a vision that this would be a place where people could live in religious freedom and where God's law would prevail. They had a vision of a holy nation. And that vision must still be with us today. The Mayflower Compact, take a look at it. It's magnificent. Sine qua non, the Declaration of Independence. It gives us the basic principle upon which this country was founded. It's an unalienable right that God has created us equal. Men, women, white, black. We're all equal in the eyes of God. It's basic to the foundation of this country. There are some things that are not new. They are old. They're venerable. They're valuable. Read the Declaration. Read that preamble. It is vital to America. It is who we are. And it's written by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, the author of the Virginia Bill on Religious Freedom, the one who purchased Louisiana, about 1/3 of our country, the Louisiana Purchase. A great man, not perfect, but who of us is perfect? You must read the Federalist Papers. This tells us about our Constitution, how it was going to be put together, how it was supposed to work, what was the vision of our founders. You should all have a copy of the Constitution. Never sacrifice your rights to political correctness or the whims of the day, or to those people who want to take away your freedom in the right that you've been given in the Constitution. I also recommend to you Washington's farewell address. You know, he could have decided that he was going to stay and make himself a king. People liked him. But he knew it was for the good of the country that he stepped down. And this gives us the country that we have today, where we have a term of office. We must listen once again to the words of President George Washington, our great first president and the father of our country. He is a secular saint. And when I went to Mount Vernon, I visited his tomb, and I knelt and I said a prayer. A great man, he must be honored always. Every American should read Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, by which he freed the slaves. Lincoln did this at his own personal risk and his own personal popularity, and yet he knew what was right. And we are always called to do what is right, even if it means personal risk. Read that Emancipation Proclamation. Read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, maybe 270 words, but he dedicated a field to those who died at Gettysburg. And who can forget those words of his? That nation of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Of the people, by the people, for the people. That's us. Take a look at President Eisenhower's farewell address to the nation. He warned against a military-industrial complex, a complex which feeds upon itself and brings us into unending wars. One of the great pieces of literature, one of the finest inaugural addresses ever delivered, John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. The young president got up and he spoke some of the most beautiful words I ever heard. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And yet, who hears that today? Who's being preached that today? Probably very, very few. This country only remains great when we do for our country, not when we expect that our country is going to give us everything for free. I highly recommend Dr. Martin Luther King's great speech, I Have a Dream. One of the most beautiful speeches ever written, talking about freedom and talking about his vision where every child will be judged not on the color of their skin, but on their character. Next, I want to recommend to you a wonderful speech by Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan wrote the speech, I think it was 1975, A Time for Choosing between freedom and tyranny of the Soviet Union. But today, too, is a time for choosing once again. We need good literature in our homes. It's some of those wonderful books that kind of capture America. They capture America and they remind us of who we are. You know, I hear that expression so many times. That's not who we are. Well, who are you? Well, let me tell you who you are. I'll tell you right now. You'll find out in some of the great books that I'm going to recommend to you. Read the Scarlet Letter. See what it says about sin, about mercy, about redemption. Some of the works of Mark Twain, especially Huckleberry Finn and the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Another book I want to recommend to you is a book called Little Women. It's not just about little girls. It's about the Civil War era and how a woman was left at home with her 4 daughters and how the family lived and the family gathered together to pray and have faith and to care for one another. Uncle Tom's Cabin will give us a picture of the horrors of slavery. Another book that I think is important for you to read is a book called The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. And To Kill a Mockingbird is the story of a man who stands up to an unjust system that's trying to railroad an innocent black man into taking responsibility for a crime he did not commit. Walt Whitman was in love with America. He could embrace America as he embraced someone that he loved. Narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, a self-made man in many ways, and someone that especially our African American students should want to emulate in what he did for his people. Lastly, and this is certainly just on a very personal note, there is a book that very close to my heart, and that is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Now, why? Well, because I come from Brooklyn, and I'm one of those trees that grew in Brooklyn. The time when I grew up, well, the soil was a lot richer, it was a lot thicker. Things have changed everywhere, not just in Brooklyn. But we have to begin to put our lives, the lives of our children, back together again. We have to be able to become strong in our faith. We have to be able to know the roots of our freedom and what other people passed on to us in the great documents that I mentioned to you, and then to really embrace and love what is good and right in the beautiful novels that I just spoke to you about. They give us really an emotional high as to who we are, what we must aspire to as God's children and as Americans. Let me close by quoting President Lincoln in his second inaugural, another magnificent piece of work. The Civil War was winding down. Lincoln himself did not have many more months to live. But he knew the country needed healing, and our country needs healing today. And instead of treating those who were conquered in a poor way, Lincoln counseled charity toward all. Let me quote to you from the ending of Lincoln's second inaugural. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. God love you. We would like to thank our generous sponsors for their wonderful support. Thanks for watching. Please join us next time for Action for Life. I'm for action, and I hope you are too. I'm Father Michael Orsi. I am your host for Action for Life Television, that good news program which talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, the big G, and the little g, all the good things that people are doing to put the gospel of life into action. So please join us for the next episode of Action for Life.